I was in uniform, leg wrecked, doctor saying disability, and then my parents said no to $5,000 because they'd just bought a boat, and then my sister laughed, and then my broke brother emptied his pockets, and then I realized family loyalty is a lie. What would you do next? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. Happens next. I was in uniform, leg wrecked, doctor saying disability, and then my parents said no to $5,000 because they'd just bought a boat, and then my sister laughed, and then my broke brother emptied his pockets, and then I realized family loyalty is a lie. What would you do next? Let me have part 1. Make sure this amass a total of 2,000 words, and remember not to scatter the lines of the script. Script should all be in straight line. Do not break the lines. Don't say in part 2 or part 3 when finishing each part. Just give a seamless curiosity and intrigue, and keeps the audience on a loop and leave them wanting more. Note: always satisfy the audience's crave in each part. Next part bigger than the last. At midsection, ask the audience where they're watching from. Not. Don't just tell the audience what, show the how it did, without leaving out even the littlest of detail. I'm going to start where the truth actually begins, not where it's convenient, because the convenient version is how people like my parents keep getting away with things. So picture this: I'm still in uniform, still smelling like dust and metal and that cheap base clinic disinfectant, and my right boot is half unlaced because my knee is swollen so big it's fighting the fabric like the uniform itself is trying to tap out, and I'm sitting on the edge of a barracks bunk with my leg elevated on a folded hoodie, staring at a scrap of paper with one number written on it, 5,000, and it's not a vacation 5,000, not a new phone 5,000. It's the walk like a normal human again 5,000, and I'm calling home thinking I'm about to hear the one sentence every kid wants to hear when their body is falling apart. Don't worry, we've got you. And instead I hear my father's voice, calm, almost polite, like he's declining an invitation to a barbecue, and he says, "Sweetheart, we just bought a boat. This isn't a good time." And then my mother sighs like I'm inconveniencing her with my bones, and then my sister laughs, actually laughs like my leg is a funny story you tell at brunch, and right there something inside me goes quiet, not dramatic, not cinematic. It's that quiet you get when your brain finally stops trying to convince you that the people who keep failing you are secretly good deep down. Because listen, you can survive pain, you can survive a torn ligament, you can survive surgery, but you cannot survive being treated like your suffering is a scheduling conflict. And here's the part that makes me want to grab you by the collar through the screen. If your parents have ever looked at your crisis and treated it like it's your personality flaw, you already know this feeling. You know that cold clarity, that, "Oh, so that's who you are" moment. And I need you to tell me in the comments when you felt that, because I swear some of y'all have been carrying the same wound in your chest for years, and you call it family. And no, I'm not exaggerating. Let me take you into the exact how of it, because this didn't start with a phone call. It started with a sound, a wet pop that didn't belong inside a human body. I was stationed about 2 hours from home. Routine training exercise, the boring kind, the one you do so many times you stop thinking about it. Movement under load, controlled pace, nothing heroic, just repetitive discipline. And I remember the air being sharp. I remember the grit under my boots. I remember thinking about something stupid, like whether the chow hall was going to have decent coffee. And then my knee did this thing where it didn't just hurt, it betrayed me, like it unhooked from my body, like somebody unplugged a cable, and the ground came up fast. And the pain hit like white noise, that kind of pain that erases language. I tried to stand, because that's what you do. You stand, you walk it off. You don't make a scene, and my leg buckled like it wasn't mine. And the medic was on me in seconds. Not gentle, not comforting, more like a command. Don't move. And his eyes narrowed in that way that tells you he's seen enough injuries to know when someone's life is about to change. And at the clinic, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead like they were proud of being indifferent. My uniform was cut at the knee, and my skin went tight and shiny and ugly, purple and yellow and darker underneath, like my body was bruising in real time just to prove a point. And the physician's assistant didn't sugarcoat anything. She tapped the screen where my MRI glowed and said, "Significant ligament damage, possibly more." And I asked, "How soon?" And she paused, and that pause was louder than the sentence that followed, because pauses from medical people are basically sirens. And she said, "This week." And then she leaned in like she was doing me a favor and whispered, "If you wait, you're looking at long-term impairment, maybe permanent." And I nodded like she'd told me the weather, because the military trains you to keep your face straight when your future is on fire. And the problem wasn't the surgery. The problem was approval, because anyone who's served knows your body belongs to the paperwork first. And the earliest the system could get me in was weeks out. Weeks I did not have. And that's when the PA slid the number across the tray like it was contraband, $5,000 up front if I went off base, and it wasn't even the full cost. It was the down payment on not limping forever. And that night the barracks were loud with normal life. Someone yelling at a video game, music bumping through thin walls, laughter from people who still trusted their joints, and I sat on my bunk with my leg wrapped in thick gauze and my boot on the floor like an abandoned shell, staring at my phone. Because I knew I was about to ask for something my family pretends they love giving, but only when it's convenient. Support, and I waited longer than I should have because there's a part of you that still hopes your parents will finally show up properly if the stakes are high enough. And then I called, and my father, Dean Mercer, answered on the third ring like he was doing me a favor. "Hey kiddo," cheerful and distracted, and I could hear something metallic in the background, tools maybe, or the TV, and I said, "Dad, I got hurt. It's bad." And I kept my voice clinical, not dramatic. I gave him the bullet points like I was briefing a superior officer: injury, surgery, timeline, cost, and I even added the part that makes me want to smack my past self. "I'll pay you back," because I'd been trained to earn help like it's a loan application, and there was silence. And then that exhale he always does before saying no, that "I'm about to teach you a lesson sigh." And he said, "We just bought the boat." And he said it like it was a medical diagnosis. Like the boat was terminal and needed all the resources, and I said, "It's my leg. If I don't do this, I might not walk right again." And he replied, "You're young, you'll adapt." And then my mother, Lorna Mercer, picked up the extension because she always enters conversations when emotions get messy. She likes to be the soft knife. And she said, "Honey, maybe this is a lesson. You chose this career. You chose the risks." And then she said, I swear I can still hear it, "A limp will teach responsibility," as if my knee was a late bill. And then my sister, Sienna, cut in bright and amused. "Relax, you always figure things out. You're the tough one, remember?" And she laughed, and I looked down at my leg and saw blood seeping through gauze turning clean white into something ugly and real. And I thought about the PA's pause and the word permanent, and I realized they were talking like my crisis was entertainment, like I was the family's durable appliance that should keep working even when it's broken. And I said, "I understand." And I did, completely. And I didn't cry, I didn't argue, I hung up and I sat there while the barracks noise kept going and the quiet inside me spread, cold and clear. And here's where I need your opinion, because this is where people start arguing in the comments. If you were me in that moment, would you still call them family after that phone call? Or would you mentally fire them on the spot? Because I know what society says. They're your parents. But society also doesn't sit in your body when your body is breaking. And then 2 days later, I'm back at my tiny off-base apartment on crutches. Every step a reminder that time is not romantic. Time is a clock with teeth. The pain meds dulled the edges, but not the fear. And I ran numbers in my head like a prison schedule, credit cards, payday loans, anything. And then there was a knock at the door, and when I opened it, my brother, Eli, was standing there in a grease-stained jacket with dark circles under his eyes, hands scarred from a mechanic shop that pays him like he's disposable. And he took one look at my leg and swore under his breath, and he didn't even ask. He just said, "They didn't help you." Not a question, and I shook my head. And without another word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick wad of bills, 10s and 20s, crumpled and worn like they'd been argued over, and he pressed them into my hand and said, "800. And I stared, because 800 from Eli isn't 800. It's blood. It's ours. It's rent money. It's skipped meals. And I said, "You need this." And he said, "I need you walking." And then he hit me with a sentence that landed like a punch and a hug at the same time. "I sold my tools, all of them." And I swear I felt my throat tighten, because my parents had assets, savings, equity, a shiny boat they named after a place they'd only been once. And my brother had nothing, and he gave me everything. And I took the money not because it was enough, it wasn't even close, but because it was proof, it was evidence, it was the first time in my life someone showed up for me without attaching a morality lesson to it. And as he left, he squeezed my shoulder and said, "You'll be okay. You always are." And I wanted to tell him, "No, I don't want to always be okay. I want to be held." But instead I nodded, because that's the family role I'd been assigned, the reliable one. And that night I didn't sleep, not because of the pain, though it pulsed in slow waves like a warning, but because my mind started replaying scenes I'd filed away as normal, scenes that were actually receipts. Like the time my sister burned through 15 grand on an online boutique and my father wrote a check without blinking, no questions, no contract, no lecture, and my mother called it supporting her dreams. And then the wellness studio with more mirrors than clients that failed, and they refinanced the house to keep it afloat, and my father said, "You have to spend money to make money." Like he was quoting scripture. And then me, 22, transmission dead, needing 2 grand just to commute. I asked for a loan, not a gift. And my father printed a contract with interest 5%. And my mother insisted it be notarized. It builds character. And I ate canned food and walked miles and paid them back early because I thought responsibility would earn respect, but it didn't. It just trained them that I could be squeezed and I would still say thank you. And sitting there with my leg elevated on mismatched pillows, I finally saw the pattern with fresh eyes. This wasn't about money. They had money. It was about value. They didn't value me. And here's where I want you to pause with me for a second, because this is the part that hits people in the bones when you're the capable one. Your family starts treating your capability like it's a resource they own, like your resilience is their excuse to neglect you. And if you've been that person, the one everyone leans on and nobody checks on, tell me right now, where are you watching from? What city? What country? Because I want to see how many people across the world are living this exact same script in different accents. And then the next morning I called the military hospital again, hoping someone somewhere had found a conscience, and the answer was the same, still pending, still under review. And I stared at the numbers in my phone I'd never wanted to use, and I went anyway, because desperation makes you brave in the worst places, and the payday lender office smelled like cheap coffee and panic. The guy behind the desk spoke in calm, rehearsed sentences, while the computer calculated how much of my future I was trading for my present. The interest rate was obscene, the repayment schedule cruel, and he asked, "Do you understand the terms?" And I said, "Yes," and signed, because when your leg is on the line, pride becomes a luxury item. And 2 days later, I'm on a gurney staring at ceiling tiles, counting cracks like they might tell me whether I'm about to wake up whole. The nurse adjusts my 4. The anesthesiologist tells me to count backward. And as the world fades, I hear my father's voice again. "We just bought the boat." And when I woke up, my leg was wrapped in layers of bandages and metal, and the pain was sharp but clean, like something had finally been set right. And the surgeon came by and said, "We got it in time. You'll recover fully if you follow rehab." And relief hit so hard it almost made me nauseous. But then reality showed up in the form of a calendar. The first loan payment due in 3 days, and I checked my bank account. $47 and some change, and my paycheck wouldn't hit for another week. And I started doing math that doesn't add up, moving numbers around like they might magically behave. I considered selling plasma, furniture, dignity, and then I remembered something small and stupid. A receipt in my jacket pocket from a gas station near the pharmacy, water, crackers, and a lottery ticket I bought as a joke to myself, because sometimes you buy hope for $2 when you've run out of better options. And I smoothed it out on the table and opened the app and checked the numbers once, then again. And I didn't scream. I didn't laugh. I just sat there listening to the refrigerator hum as my heartbeat slowed, because it wasn't a headline jackpot. It wasn't fireworks, but it was enough to breathe, enough to think, enough to stop being hunted by panic. And I didn't tell anyone, not Eli, not my parents, definitely not my sister, because I already knew what would happen. They'd smell opportunity like sharks smell blood. And instead I called a lawyer, not the billboard kind, the kind in a glass building who charges by the hour, because he's not selling hope, he's selling precision. And when I rolled into his office on crutches looking like someone who took a wrong turn into adulthood, he didn't pity me, he just listened. And I told him I wanted 2 things, assets protected and a full understanding of my parents' finances. And he studied me for a long moment and said, "That second part changes things." And I said, "I know. That's why I'm here." And when I left his office, my phone buzzed with a text from Eli. "How's the leg?" And I typed back, "Getting there. Thanks again." And he replied with a thumbs up and a joke about borrowing my crutches if his knee went out. And I stared at that message a long time, because it hit me how backwards this was. The poorest person in my family was the richest in character, and the richest people acted bankrupt where it counted. And that's when the plan in my head stopped being a daydream and became a decision, because I was done begging for love like it was a loan. I was done being the family's emergency fund and emotional punching bag, and I wasn't going to do anything loud or sloppy. I was going to do it the way the military trained me, quiet, intentional, clean. And the next time my father said, "This isn't a good time," I wanted him to finally understand what those words feel like when they come back around, and the wild part is, at that moment, I still hadn't decided whether I wanted revenge or justice. I only knew I wanted control because control is what people like my parents steal from you. First, and as I sat there with my leg elevated and my lawyer's card in my hand, I realized something that should scare you. If you've ever underestimated the tough one in your family, the dependable one doesn't become dangerous when they get angry. They become dangerous when they get calm. And then my phone rang again, and this time it wasn't my brother, and it wasn't the hospital. It was my mother, and she sounded sweet. Too sweet, like she was calling to check on me, and my stomach dropped. Because I heard something in her tone I hadn't heard before. Curiosity, not concern, like she'd caught the scent of money or an opportunity, and she said, "Honey, how are you paying for all this?" And I looked at the ceiling and smiled a little, because the real story was about to begin, and I knew if I answered that question wrong, I'd lose the advantage, but if I answered it right, they would walk themselves straight into the exact consequence they'd been dodging for years, and I'm telling you right now, what happened next made the boat look like the cheapest mistake they ever made. My mother's, "How are you paying for all this?" wasn't a mother checking on her child. It was a cashier scanning items, and I heard it instantly. That sweet syrupy tone people use when they're about to ask for something they didn't earn. And I leaned back on my couch, my leg propped up, the room smelling like antiseptic wipes and stale pain meds, and I said, "I'm handling it." And as she went quiet for half a second, just long enough to confirm what I already knew, she wasn't relieved, she was disappointed I didn't open the vault, and then she tried again, softer. "Honey, you don't have to carry everything alone," which is hilarious coming from someone who literally told me a limp would build character, and I said, "I'll be fine." And then she sighed like I was being stubborn, like I was refusing her a favor, and she added, "Your father's been worried." And I almost laughed because that man wasn't worried about my leg. He was worried about being seen as the kind of father who lets his kid get broken and then says the boat matters more. And then right on cue, Dean Mercer took the phone, and his voice was different, not kind, not calm, suddenly businesslike, like he was negotiating. "Listen," he said, "we can't help with cash right now, but we can support you in other ways." And I said, "Like what?" And he said, "Like advice." And I swear my brain did that thing where it tries to protect you by going numb. Because imagine refusing $5,000 and offering advice. Like a coupon, and then he went straight into the performance. "You need to be careful with debt. You don't want to ruin your credit." And I stare at my ceiling, jaw tight, thinking, you just watched me sign my future away because you bought a boat, and now you're worried about my credit score. And I said, "I've already handled it." And he asked, "How?" And I could hear the hunger in that one word, not "How are you feeling?" Not "Are you scared?" Just how, because to people like him, money is the only language that counts, and I gave him nothing, "Don't worry about it." And his tone sharpened, "I am worried about it, I'm your father." And there it was, the classic line, the title used like a weapon after they refused to do the job, and I said, "If you were worried, I wouldn't have had to go off base." And he snapped back, "We didn't tell you to do that." And my mother murmured, "Let's not fight." And my sister Sienna chimed in with a fake little laugh. "Okay, drama, can we not do this right now?" Like my leg was a vibe killer, and I hung up again, not because I was brave, but because I was tired of being emotionally mugged in my own living room. And then I did something I had never done before in my life. I told myself the truth out loud. I said, "They're going to come back for something." And that sentence sat in the room like a heavy object, because if you've lived with manipulators, you know they don't disappear, they circle. They wait for your weakness to look like an opening, and then they call it family. And I want to ask you something real quick. If your parents refused life-changing help and then turned around and tried to interrogate your finances, what would you do? Would you lie? Would you cut them off? Would you confront them? Because my old instinct was to explain myself until they approved of me. But my new instinct, the one that woke up the moment Dean said the boat mattered more, that instinct said, "Shut up and watch." So I watched, and the watching started with paperwork. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. Revenge isn't a scream. Revenge is a spreadsheet. Revenge is a quiet meeting in a quiet office where you stop being someone's child and start being someone's consequence. And I met my lawyer again 2 days later, crutches squeaking on polished floors, the elevator smelling like cologne and money, and he had a folder already waiting, thick, heavy, the kind of folder that changes how you breathe when you open it, and he didn't do drama, he did facts. You said you want to understand your parents' finances, he told me. So we pulled everything we can legally obtain, public records, lien searches, business filings, property records, and then we cross-referenced patterns. And I said, patterns? And he nodded. People lie in words, they don't lie in payments. And he slid a page toward me, and it showed refinances, multiple, stacked like a Jenga tower. And the house I grew up in wasn't a nest egg, it was a leveraged costume. And the boat wasn't a paid-off trophy. It was a loan with a fat interest rate and a down payment sitting on a maxed credit card. And my sister's business wasn't a business, it was a bonfire. Payroll paid by pulling equity out of the house. Taxes messy in that dangerous way that isn't just disorganized, it's negligent. And I stared at those numbers until my mouth went dry. Because now the refusal made a different kind of sense. Not a better sense, a uglier one. It wasn't we love the boat more. It was we're drowning and we'll let you drown too if it keeps us afloat. And my lawyer said something that hit like a slap. They're not wealthy, he said. They're performing wealthy. And listen, if you've ever been the scapegoat in a family that worships appearances, you know that performance is a religion. It's why they'll buy expensive things while the lights flicker. It's why they'll host dinners while debt collectors call. It's why they'll sacrifice you and call it a lesson. Because the image matters more than the people inside it. And I sat there thinking about my brother Eli selling his tools, and I felt this quiet rage that wasn't loud enough to scream but deep enough to build something. And I asked my lawyer, so what happens when it collapses? And he said, creditors come, liens pile, the house becomes a target, and if your name is connected in any way, you could get dragged into the blast radius. And he paused, which is why most people would protect themselves and step back. And I looked at him and said, I don't want to step back. And he lifted his eyebrows like he was listening carefully now. What do you want? And I told him the truth. I want them to experience the rules the way I had to. And he didn't flinch, he just nodded once. Then you need a structure. And what happened next is the part people never believe is real until it's too late. Because families like mine assume consequences are for strangers, not for them. So here's how you make consequences real without breaking a single law. You build a wall between your identity and your action, and you let contracts do the talking. My lawyer walked me through it like a map. Step 1. Form an LLC, clean name, nothing that points back to you, no Mercer Holdings, no cute inside joke, just something bland that could belong to anyone. Step 2. Set up an operating agreement, keep it tight, keep it legal. Step 3. You don't contact them, you don't threaten them, you don't text your sister a cryptic message. You do nothing that tips your hand. You let a professional intermediary be the face, because if you show your face too early, they'll fight you emotionally. They'll rewrite history. They'll call you ungrateful. But if they think it's a stranger, they'll get arrogant and careless. And I'm telling you, arrogance is the easiest door to unlock because the person on the other side thinks they're too important to be robbed. And then my lawyer explained the real lever. Banks don't love bad loans, he said. They love clean books. If your parents are behind, if they're distressed, those lenders may be willing to settle, repackage, or sell that debt. And he let the idea hang in the air, and my brain clicked into the same mode it clicked into during training, assess, plan, execute, and I asked, you mean I can buy it? And he said, potentially, and the word potentially felt like oxygen because suddenly this wasn't about my feelings, it was about control. And control is the one thing my parents never wanted me to have. Because if the dependable kid gets control, the family's whole rig system falls apart. And over the next couple weeks, while I was learning to bend my knee again in physical therapy, wobbling on balance boards, sweating through controlled lunges, biting my tongue through pain that felt like my body was remembering betrayal, I was also signing documents, answering questions, moving carefully, and I didn't tell anyone, not Eli, not my friends, because this kind of plan dies in daylight. And the more my leg healed, the more my brain sharpened, because physical therapy teaches you something financial planning also teaches you. Tiny consistent moves beat emotional outbursts every time. And then the intermediary came into play, a polished voice with a polished email address, the kind of person my parents respect because it sounds expensive, and the message was simple, professional, flattering even. We specialize in distressed asset solutions and believe we can provide immediate relief while preserving your lifestyle. And when my lawyer showed me the draft, I almost smiled because my parents were going to fall in love with the phrase, preserving your lifestyle. That's basically their love language, and the meeting was set at a private lunch club downtown, the kind of place my father loves because the chairs feel important and the waiters call him sir. And I wasn't going, not yet, because again, silence is power. And while all that was happening, my parents started Calling more, not to apologize, not to check on my rehab, but to probe. My mother asked if I was seeing anyone because she always asks that when she's trying to figure out if there's a new source of money in my life. My sister asked if the military paid out for injuries like mine, and my father started dropping these fake concern lines. Just don't do anything desperate. And every time they asked, I answered with less and less. And you could hear them getting irritated because when you stop feeding a manipulator information, they start acting like you're doing something to them. And then one night, right after a brutal PT session where I had to relearn how to trust my leg under my own weight, my phone buzzed with a photo from Sienna. A selfie on a boat, champagne flute in hand, caption blessed. And I stared at it thinking, you laughed when I was bleeding through gauze, and now you're drinking on the very thing they chose over me. And I want you to understand this, I didn't feel jealous, I felt awake, and I typed back nothing because silence again. And then the day of their lunch meeting came, and I didn't sit in that room, but I listened to the recording afterward, and hearing my father's voice in that setting, trying to sound powerful while asking for rescue, it was almost comedic. He kept saying words like strategy and restructure and temporary liquidity issue. And my mother asked questions only about privacy. Will our neighbors know? And my sister talked about expansion like she was pitching investors instead of begging for relief. And then the intermediary slid the contract across the table, and it was long, dense, 50 pages of clean legal language. And buried inside it was the clause that made my stomach settle into that calm I told you about. The calm of inevitability, strict compliance terms, late payment equals termination, misuse equals termination, no grace, no emotional appeals, no, but we're family. Just a timer, and they didn't read it. I know they didn't, because people like my parents never read warnings. They assume warnings are for other people. And when my father signed, I felt something click into place like a lock turning. And that night, I stood up from my couch without my crutches for the first time, just to test myself. And my leg held, and I took a careful step, and then another, and I wasn't limping. And for the first time since that wet pop on the training field, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I could finally stand without begging anyone to save me. And if you think the story ends with a signature, you don't know how people like my parents work, because once they think they've gotten away with something, they get loud, they get sloppy, they start celebrating early, and that sloppiness was exactly what I was counting on. Because the next phase wasn't me attacking them, it was me letting them be themselves long enough to step into the consequence they signed with their own hand. And the scary part is, the first crack didn't come from a big mistake. It came from a tiny one. The kind of tiny mistake arrogant people make because they assume the world will bend for them. And when that crack showed up, it showed up quietly, like an email they didn't read, like a payment they assumed went through, like a deadline they thought was negotiable. And I watched it happen in real time. And I realized something that made my blood run cold and hot at the same time. The thing they used to say to me, "You'll adapt," was about to become their problem. And then my intermediary texted one sentence that made my heart slow down in a way that felt almost peaceful. They missed a requirement. And I stared at that message, knowing the next conversation I had with my parents would not be as their daughter. It would be as the consequence they never believed could wear my face. The moment I got that text, they missed a requirement. I didn't jump up and start celebrating like some cartoon villain. I just sat there with my legs stretched out, ankle resting on a folded towel, ice pack melting into the fabric, and I stared at the wall long enough to hear the building's pipes click, because the craziest part about consequences is how quiet they are when they arrive. No thunder, no dramatic music, just a timestamp and a signature you forgot you wrote. And then I did what I've been trained to do since basic. I checked facts, I confirmed the situation, and then I moved with intention, because this wasn't about humiliating them. This was about stopping them from ever having the power to decide whether my body deserved help again. And the intermediary called me 10 minutes later, voice smooth, almost bored, like she was reading off a weather report. "They missed the payment window," she said. "It was scheduled, reminders were sent, their portal attempt failed, and the cure period is not applicable under the clause they signed." And I felt my throat tighten, not because I was scared, but because I could already picture Dean's face when he realizes the world doesn't accept excuses from men who think they're too important to read. And I asked, "What time did it lapse?" And she replied, 12:01 a.m. per contract definition. And I swear, 12:01 a.m. sounded like a gun click. Tiny, precise, irreversible. And then my lawyer called right after, because he didn't like surprises, he liked clean moves. "We're fully within the contract," he said, "but you need to decide what you want the next step to look like." And I told him the truth. I want a clean, professional, no yelling, no family drama, no chance for them to spin this into our daughter is crazy. I want it to feel like Gravity. And he said, then we do it through process. And process looks boring until it destroys you. Process looks like an email titled compliance review. Process looks like a scheduled meeting in a neutral office. Process looks like people in suits who don't care about your tears. And the meeting invite went out that same morning, and it was worded so politely it almost made me laugh. We need to discuss a minor compliance irregularity and confirm your understanding of the agreement. Minor irregularity, like missing a payment, was a coffee stain. And the reason we used that language wasn't to be nice, it was to keep them calm, because calm people walk into traps. And 2 days later, I got a call from my mother, Mara Mercer, and she sounded cheerful in a way that made my skin crawl. Like she'd slipped on her public mother voice. Sweetheart, she said, your father said you've been distant. Are you still upset? And I stared at my knee, the scar hidden under the wrap, and I thought about how she called permanent damage a lesson. And I said, I'm recovering, and she chirped, good, good. And listen, we're having some meetings about the house and the business. It's all very adult. She laughed like she was bonding with me. You wouldn't understand the details, but it's exciting. And I could hear Sienna in the background tell her about the new bracelet, because my sister can't breathe unless someone is watching, and my mother lowered her voice like she was sharing tea. We're finally working with people who see our value, not like those banks. And I almost said, you mean the banks you begged to save you? But I didn't. I just let her talk, because people reveal themselves when you don't interrupt. And then she slid into the real reason for the call. So, about your surgery, she said, how much did it end up costing altogether? And I paused, because here's the comedy of it. They refused $5,000 when it mattered, and now they wanted numbers so they could decide how useful my injury could be to them. And I said, enough. And she chuckled awkwardly. Well, we're family, honey. I just want to make sure you're not drowning. And I said, I'm not. And she went quiet again, disappointed again, and then Dean grabbed the phone, because he always has to be the one to close. Listen, he said, we have a meeting downtown tomorrow, and I want you to come by afterward. You've been hiding out. And I said, I can't. And he snapped, you can. Like the word no didn't exist in his world unless he was saying it to me. And I kept my voice steady. I have physical therapy. And he scoffed, therapy can wait. And I said, my leg can't. And the silence that followed was thick, because what I said wasn't just about my leg, it was about my life. And then he tried a new tactic, softer, fake warm. We've been meaning to talk about helping you get back on your feet. And I almost choked, because the irony is disgusting. We might be able to pull something together now, he continued. Not money exactly, but maybe contacts, connections. You know, I know people. And that was my father's favorite currency. Access. He gives you a handshake and calls it love. And I said, I'm good. And he exhaled through his nose, irritated, and then Sienna grabbed the phone and went straight for the jugular. Are you mad at me? She asked, like this was about her feelings, because Dad said you've been acting weird since the injury. And I said, I'm focused on healing. And she laughed. You're so intense. It was just bad timing. And you always make everything so serious. And I wanted to scream, bad timing is forgetting someone's birthday. Not choosing a boat over your sister's ability to walk, but I didn't scream. I just said, I have to go. And she said, wait, wait, wait. And then she did the thing she always does. She dangled a little crumb like she was feeding a dog. We're planning something big soon, like really big, and I want you there because it'll look good, like family unity. And there it was again, the truth. I'm not a daughter to them. I'm a prop. I'm good for photos, good for reputation. Good for proving they're not the kind of parents who abandon their injured kid. And I hung up, and I called my brother Eli immediately, because he's the only person in that family who has ever felt like home. And he answered out of breath, the sound of an impact wrench screaming in the background. Yo, he said, you okay? And that one sentence, you okay, not how much did it cost, not are you over it, just you okay, it made my chest go tight. And I said, I'm okay, I just wanted to hear your voice. And he laughed. That's the weirdest compliment I've ever gotten. And then he softened. How's the leg for real? And I told him. I walked across my living room without crutches, and he whistled. Look at you. And I said, Eli, if Mom and Dad call you, if they say anything about the house, or money, or some new deal, don't sign anything, don't promise anything, just don't. And he went quiet, because Eli isn't stupid. He's just been trained his whole life to expect less. And he said, are you in trouble? And I said, No. And that was the truth. But they might be. And he said, good. Not like he was celebrating. Like he was finally letting himself admit he was tired too. And then he lowered his voice. They came by the shop last week. And my stomach dropped. What? I said, and he continued. Not inside, just outside. Dad looked like he wanted to yell, and Mom looked like she wanted to cry. And Sienna was filming something in the car, like always, and I gripped the edge of my couch. They didn't talk to you? I asked, and he said, nah, I didn't give them the chance. I walked out and said, this place is busy, what do you need? And Dad did that fake laugh. The one he does when he's trying not to be embarrassed. And he said, we were just checking on your sister. Like you don't exist unless you're useful. And Eli exhaled hard. I told them you were healing, and Dad said, good, she'll adapt. And when Eli repeated my father's words, I felt the same cold, quiet settle in my body that I felt the night of the injury, because Dean didn't just say that to me. It's his worldview. It's how he sleeps at night. He tells himself other people can adapt, so he doesn't have to change. And I said, did they ask about me? And Eli snorted. Only in the way people ask if the dog is trained yet. And I closed my eyes because it was brutal, but it was also clarifying, and clarifying is power. And the next day, the meeting happened, the compliance review, and I didn't go in trembling like a hurt child. I went in steady like an officer walking into a briefing, my leg brace hidden under my trousers, my crutches left in the car because I wasn't giving them the satisfaction of seeing me as weak. And the office was the kind of place that smells like printer toner and expensive hand soap, the kind of place where everyone speaks softly because they think loud people are uncivilized. And my intermediary sat at the table with my lawyer, and the chair at the head of the table was empty on purpose, a small psychological detail, because when people like my father walk in and see the boss chair, they aim for it automatically, and Dean did exactly that. He strode in like he owned the air, Mara behind him clutching her purse like a shield, Sienna trailing last, phone in hand, lips glossy, eyes scanning for angles, and Dean tried to shake the intermediary's hand too hard, trying to dominate even a greeting, and he said, all right, let's make this quick. And the intermediary smiled politely and said, of course, Mr. Mercer. This is simply a routine review. And Dean smirked, good, because we have a boat inspection at 2. And my lawyer's face didn't move at all, which is what you want in a lawyer. You want a person whose emotions cannot be purchased. And then Dean sat in the head chair like a king, and Mara sat beside him, and Sienna sat on the other side, still tapping her phone. And then my intermediary opened a thin folder, not the thick contract, not the scary paperwork, just a thin folder, because thin folders terrify arrogant people more. Thin folders mean the other side doesn't need a lot of paper to bury you. And she said, we have a time-stamped payment failure. And Dean waved his hand. Yeah, technical glitch. We tried the portal. And she nodded pleasantly. The contract defines payment as received, not attempted. And Dean's smile twitched, and Mara leaned forward. Surely there's a grace period. And the intermediary looked directly at her and said, there isn't. And you could feel the temperature change in the room, like someone lowered the thermostat, and Sienna finally put her phone down, eyes narrowing. This is getting intense, she whispered like it was a show. And Dean snapped, it's fine. And then my intermediary slid a single page across the table, and the header read notice of termination. And Dean stared at it for a full second like his brain couldn't translate it. And then he laughed, one sharp laugh. This is ridiculous. And my lawyer finally spoke, calm, quiet, deadly. It's contractual. And Dean's eyes flicked around the room looking for someone to intimidate, someone to shame, someone to bully into bending. And then he looked toward the head chair again like he was trying to remind himself he was still in control. And that's when the door behind them opened. Soft click, and the last person to walk in didn't make a big entrance, no dramatics, just footsteps, steady, familiar, and Sienna turned first, and her face changed, and Mara's hand went to her throat, and Dean's mouth opened like he was about to bark an order, but the sound didn't come out, because the person who walked in wasn't a banker, wasn't a stranger, and wasn't a lawyer either. It was me, and I didn't rush, I didn't smile. I just walked to the empty chair at the head of the table and sat down like I belonged there, because I did, and I looked at my parents the same way I look at a training injury report, factual, unemotional, and I said, hi. And Dean finally found his voice, but it came out as a whisper full of disbelief. What is this? And I leaned forward just slightly, just enough to make them feel the weight of the moment, and I said, "It's the part where you find out what you signed." And my father's eyes darted to the termination notice, then back to me, then to Mara, then to Sienna, and I watched him realize, in real time, that the thing he always assumed would protect him, contracts and systems and paperwork, had finally chosen a side, and it wasn't his. Dean's face did this strange thing where anger tried to sprint forward, but embarrassment grabbed it by the throat. And that's the first time I realized intimidation only works when the other person still needs you, and I didn't need him anymore. Not for money, not for approval, not for a story where he gets to be the hero. And then Mara's voice cracked before it fully formed. "Why are you here?" she asked, like I'd shown up to ruin a birthday party, and Sienna whispered, "This is insane." The concept of consequences offended her personally, and I kept my hands flat on the table because I wanted them to see how steady I was. No shaking, no pleading, no little girl energy, just calm. And I said, "I'm here because this agreement is mine." And Dean barked out a laugh that sounded like metal scraping concrete. "Yours," he repeated, and then he turned to the intermediary like I was an annoying fly. "Who is she to you?" And the intermediary answered without flinching, "She is the principal." And my father's eyes widened, and I watched him replay every conversation where he'd treated me like I was built to absorb pain quietly, and then he tried to seize the frame again, because men like Dean can't survive without a frame they control. So he leaned forward, voice low, "You did this behind our backs." And I tilted my head, not dramatic, just enough to show I was thinking, and I said, "You did my surgery refusal to my face." And Mara sucked in a breath like I'd slapped her. And she started doing what she always does when she wants to avoid blame. She reached for morality. "We were teaching you responsibility," she said, and I almost smiled because of how predictable it was, and I said, "No, you were teaching me my pain is inconvenient." And Sienna cut in quick, defensive, "You're twisting everything." And I looked at her, and my voice stayed even. "Sienna, you laughed." And her cheeks flushed. "I was stressed," she snapped. "It was a joke." And I nodded slowly. It was my leg. And the room went quiet again because truth is like that. It doesn't have to shout. It just sits there and makes everyone uncomfortable. And then Dean slammed his palm on the table. Not hard enough to be violence, but hard enough to perform power. "You think you're smart," he said. "You think you can take her home?" And I didn't flinch. I let him watch my eyes stay locked, and I said, "I don't think I know." And that's when Mara started crying, but not the kind of crying that's apology. It was the kind that's panic, the kind that says my image is falling apart, and she whispered, "Sweetheart, please." And if you've ever been the dependable one in a family like this, you know that word please is not always love. Sometimes it's just a last-minute tool. And I asked you, yes, you watching right now, if your parents told you your ability to walk wasn't worth $5,000 because they bought a toy, and then they cried later because their toy choices finally caught up to them, would you fold? Would you forgive instantly? Would you pretend the original injury never happened? Because that's the trap. They want you to treat the consequence like the crime. And I didn't. I stayed in the facts, and I slid a copy of the clause across the table. Not the entire contract, just the part they ignored, and I said, "This is what you signed." And Dean snatched it like he could tear the meaning out of the paper. His eyes scanning, jaw tightening, and he muttered, "This is predatory." And my lawyer spoke with that smooth, courtroom calm voice. It's standard in sale-leaseback structures where default risk is high. And Dean snapped, "We were not high risk." And my lawyer didn't blink. "Your bank records and delinquency history say otherwise." And that line hit Mara like a body blow because she had built her whole personality on being the responsible mother. And I watched her realize that professionals saw through the act instantly, and Sienna's lips parted as if she'd finally noticed the oxygen in the room had changed. "Wait," she said slowly, "bank records," and then she turned to Dean. "Dad, what did you tell them?" And Dean shot her a look that said shut up, but she wouldn't shut up because when Sienna smells danger, she looks for someone to sacrifice, and she stared at my lawyer. "We can fix this," she said quickly. "We can make a payment right now, we can do a wire, we can do whatever. We have investors." And I almost laughed because her investors were always just people she flirted with at networking events and then ghosted when the paperwork showed up. And I said, "The contract defines timing, not intention." And she snapped, "You're enjoying this." And I leaned in slightly, eyes on hers, and I said, "No, I'm understanding you." And that made her go quiet because she didn't know how to argue with being seen clearly. And then Dean did what men like him always do when logic corners them. He escalated emotionally. After everything we did for you, he hissed. Feeding you, clothing you, raising you. Like parenting was a bill he expected interest on, and I said, "You're right, you raised me." And he lifted his chin like he'd won, and then I finished. "You raised me to read what I sign." And Mara sobbed louder and reached for my hand like we were in a movie where mothers get forgiven, and I pulled my hand back gently, not cruel, just firm, and I said, "Don't touch me like you were there." And I saw her face crumple because she wanted the comfort of being mom, without ever doing the work of being safe. And then Dean's voice dropped to something almost dangerous. "If you do this, you're dead to us." And I held his gaze and said, "I was dead to you when you chose a boat over my leg." And there it is, the true moment, the shift, because he realized he couldn't punish me with abandonment anymore. He'd used that weapon my whole life, affection as leverage, and it didn't work now. And you could see him scrambling for another weapon, another angle, and then he blurted the dumbest thing he could have said, the thing arrogant people always say when they think secrets equal power. "There's money you don't know about," he snapped, "accounts you'll never touch." And the intermediary's pen paused. My lawyer's eyes flicked up, and Mara froze, and Sienna's head whipped toward him like, "What did you just say?" And Dean realized too late he'd spoken in front of professionals who document everything, and I watched his confidence fracture, and I didn't raise my voice, I didn't smile. I just said, "Thank you." And he frowned, confused, and I continued, "Because that sentence is why my attorney already filed a report." And the silence that followed was a normal silence. It was the kind where even the air feels like it's holding its breath. And Mara's crying stopped mid-sob like someone hit pause, and Sienna whispered, "Report," and Dean's face went pale under the anger. "What report?" he demanded, and my lawyer answered, "A disclosure related to offshore concealment allegations." And Dean stood so fast his chair scraped. "You traitor." He spat at me, and I stayed seated, because the strongest move in a room is often not moving, and I said, "You called me sweetheart while refusing to help me walk." And then I added, "Don't talk to me about loyalty." And that's when security shifted at the door, subtle, professional, because voices were rising and suits like control, and Dean realized he couldn't bully his way out, and he snapped at Mara, "Get up." And Mara didn't move because she was staring at me like I was a stranger wearing her daughter's face, and Sienna's eyes darted around calculating how to spin this online, and I stood, slowly, letting my healed leg take my weight, and that small physical detail mattered, because I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to understand that the very thing they dismissed as adaptable had become the foundation of what I was doing, and I said, "You have until the end of the week to vacate." And Mara made a choking sound. "You can't," she whispered, and I replied, "I can, and you signed that I could." And then I looked at Sienna. "And if you try to move assets or hide property, it will only get worse." And she blinked hard like she was trying to wake up from a nightmare, and I turned to Dean one last time. "You taught me a limp would teach responsibility." I said, "You were right, it did." And then I walked out of that office without looking back, and the hallways smelled like lemon cleaner and cold air, and my heart was pounding, not from fear, but from the rush of finally watching the rigged referee get forced to play by the same rules. And the second the elevator doors closed, my phone buzzed with a message from my attorney that made my stomach drop in the best and worst way, because it meant the next domino wasn't just financial anymore, it was legal, and it was already moving. And if you think what happened in that room was the big moment, you're not seeing the real fuse yet, because the real explosion starts when people like Dean realize their secrets aren't secrets, and then they get desperate, and desperate people don't just beg, they attack. And I knew exactly who he would run to first to try to fix me, and then my phone rang again, and it was Eli. Eli's name on my screen hit me harder than any threat Dean spat in that room, because Eli is the one person in this entire mess who never used love like a leash, and I answered fast. "You okay?" And he didn't even say hello first, he said. "They came to the shop," and my stomach dropped because I could already picture it. Dean marching in like he owned oxygen, Mara doing the teary soft voice, Sienna hovering like a camera lens. And I said, "Right now." And Eli exhaled, a slow, tired sound. "They already left," he said, "but Liv, it was ugly." And let me pause right here and ask you something before I keep going, because I want you in this with me, not just watching it like a movie. If you were Eli, grease under your nails, working 60 hours a week, finally breathing because your sister's about to walk again, and the same parents who wouldn't spare $5,000 show up demanding loyalty like it's rent money, what would you do? Would you freeze? Would you fold? Would you explode? Because Eli did something different. He got quiet, and that matters, and he started talking, and I could hear the shop in the background. That familiar chorus of impact wrenches and radio static and the little bell over the door that rings like a warning. And he said, Dad walked in first, didn't even look at the cars, didn't say good morning, nothing, just marched straight to the counter like it was a courtroom. And then he lowered his voice and went. And then Mom followed, crying already, like she preloaded the tears on purpose. And I closed my eyes because that's exactly what Mara does. She weaponizes softness. She'll throw a blanket over a knife and call it care, and Eli said. And then Sienna comes in behind them, and she's acting like she's concerned, like, we just want to talk. But she's also recording Liv. I saw her phone, and I felt heat crawl up my neck, because of course she was recording. She's always gathering footage for the version of reality where she's innocent. And I said, what did Dean say? And Eli laughed once, short and bitter. He said he needed to speak to the owner, and then he mimicked Dean's voice perfectly, that entitled calm that always comes right before the guilt trip. I need to speak to whoever's in charge here. And Eli told him, I'm in charge. And then Dean did what Dean always does when someone below him claims authority. He pretended he didn't hear it. He looked past Eli like Eli was a chair, and he said, no, the real owner. And here's the pattern interrupt you need to catch, because it tells you everything about these families. The scapegoat can become a CEO, and the parents will still talk to the imaginary man they think must be behind it, because the truth would break their ego. And Eli said, Dad, I am the owner. And then Dean's face twisted and he snapped, you don't own anything. And Eli paused and said, that's when I knew he was scared. And I asked, what did Mom do? And Eli sighed. She stepped forward, like she was going to hug me. And I swear that one detail made my skin crawl, because Mara hugs when she wants you to forget what she did. She hugs to erase accountability. And Eli said, I stepped back, and she froze, and then she switched tactics instantly, voice trembling. Eli, honey, we're family. And Eli told her, family doesn't show up only when the locks change. And I don't know if you've ever felt proud and heartbroken at the same time, but that's what hit me, because he learned that line the hard way. And then Eli said, Sienna tried to jump in, acting like she was mediating, and he imitated her too, that sweet bright tone she uses when she's about to stab you with a compliment. Guys, please, this is getting dramatic. And he said she looked around the shop like it offended her, like the smell of oil didn't match her curated life. And then she said, Liv is being manipulated. And I laughed out loud. I couldn't help it, because isn't that always the line? The moment you stop obeying, they decide you must be under someone's spell, as if the only way you could set boundaries is if a stranger told you to. And I said, what did you say? And Eli said, I told her the only manipulation I saw was a phone in her hand recording my reaction. And he said she went stiff, like he'd slapped her with a mirror. And then Dean leaned over the counter, voice sharp, tell your sister to stop this. And Eli said, stop what? And Dean said, stop trying to ruin us. And here's the thing, listen close. People like Dean call consequences ruin, because if they admit it's consequence, they have to admit they earned it. And Eli said, you refused to help her walk. And Dean snapped back, we had reasons. And Mara cut in quickly, it was a bad time. And Eli said, it was her leg. And then, according to Eli, the shop went quiet in that weird way it does when even the radio seems to listen. And then one of Eli's guys in the bay, a quiet dude named Marcos who never speaks, unless something's on fire, walked up wiping his hands and asked, everything good up front? And Dean turned like he was annoyed to be interrupted by labor, and Eli said, yeah, we're good. And Marcos didn't move. He just stood there, and that's when Dean realized he couldn't dominate this room the way he dominates living rooms, because living rooms are controlled by shame and history. But shops are controlled by reality and other men who don't care about your last name. And Dean's voice softened, fake calm. We're just here to talk as a family. And Marcos nodded once and said, cool, do it outside. And then he walked back to the bay like he'd just moved a piece on a chessboard and didn't need to explain himself. And Eli told me, "Liv." I wanted to laugh and I wanted to cry, because that's what happens when strangers offer more protection than your own parents ever did. And then Dean snapped at Eli, "You're choosing her over us." And Eli said, "No, I'm choosing right over. Wrong." And Mara started crying harder, and she said the most disgusting thing. She said, "We're your parents, we deserve respect." And Eli told her, "Respect isn't a debit card you swipe after you max it out." And I had to sit down on the curb outside the building because my legs were steady but my chest felt tight, and Eli kept talking. And then Sienna said, "You're going to regret this when Dad's gone." And that line right there is the family loyalty trap dressed up as grief. It's a threat with a halo on it. And I need your honest take. Would that line work on you? Because it works on so many people. It's how they keep you obedient. They say love is time limited, so your boundaries are cruelty. And Eli said, "I told her I would regret letting Dad treat Liv like she was disposable." And he said Sienna's mouth fell open like she'd never heard anyone say the quiet part out loud. And then Dean did something that made my attorney's later message make perfect sense. "Eli," said Dean, lowered his voice and said, "We can make this easy or hard." And Eli went, "That's a threat." And Dean said, "It's advice." And then he tapped the counter with 2 fingers like punctuation and said, "She doesn't know who she's messing with." And Eli said, "She does." And then Dean said, "No, she doesn't, because if she did, she'd remember who paid for her childhood." And Eli told him, "You mean who paid for Sienna's businesses?" And Mara gasped like Eli had cursed in church, and Sienna snapped, "Shut up." And then she turned her phone toward Eli and said, "Say that again." And Eli said, "Stop recording." And she said, "It's for my safety." And Eli said, "No, it's for your story." And then Dean did the move I feared. He tried to drag Eli into the guilt contract. He said, "If you love your sister, you'll talk sense into her." And Eli said, "If you loved your daughter, you would have helped her walk." And then, get this, Dean smiled. Not a happy smile, a chilling one, and he said, "We'll see." And he turned to leave, and Mara followed, still crying, but she wasn't crying for Liv. She was crying for her life collapsing. And then Sienna lingered at the door and looked back at Eli and said, "You're going to be sorry when this blows up." And Eli said, "It already blew up, you're just smelling smoke late." And then the doorbell rang as they left, and Eli said it sounded like a verdict. And after he told me all that, I went silent because my mind was already running the next sequence. Dean threatens, then Dean recruits, then Dean lies. And then Dean tries to punish you socially when he can't punish you financially. And I said, "Did they touch anything? Did they get in your office?" And Eli said, "No." Marco stood by the door the whole time like a bouncer in coveralls. And I exhaled and said, "Good." And then I told Eli, "Listen to me, do not talk to them alone again. If they show up, call me, call the attorney, call the cops if you have to." And Eli said, "I know." And then he got quiet and he said, "Liv, are we the bad guys?" And that question, that right there, is why people like us get trapped for years. Because the scapegoat has a conscience, and the abuser uses that conscience like a handle. And I said, "No." And I said it in a way I needed him to feel in his bones. "We are not the bad guys for refusing to be used." And I added, "They are calling us cruel because we stopped being convenient." And Eli didn't answer for a second, and then he said, "Okay." And his voice sounded steadier, and then he said, "But Dad's going to do something." And I looked up at the sky, and it was bright and ordinary, and that contrast made me want to scream, and I said, "I know." And then, as if the universe wanted to prove my point immediately, my attorney texted while I was still on the phone with Eli, just 3 words, "Filed this morning," and my mouth went dry because I knew what this was. It was the first public move, the kind of move Dean makes when he wants to turn you into the villain in front of witnesses. And I told Eli, "I have to go." And he said, "Love you." And I said, "Love you too." And then I opened the message and saw the attachment title, and it made my hands go cold because it wasn't a lawsuit about the house, it wasn't even about money. It was a petition that weaponized something personal, something reputational, something designed to make people doubt my sanity and my character. And I want you to tell me right now in the comments if your parent couldn't control you with love and couldn't control you with money, what's the next thing they'd try to control you with? Because Dean just showed his hand, and it was nastier than I expected. And then my phone rang again, and this time it wasn't Eli. It was a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Hi, this is Carla from the command office. We need you to come in today." And the way she said today told me Dean had already taken his mess to my career. And that's when I realized the real fight wasn't just about a house. It was about whether he could still ruin my life with a phone call. And I grabbed my keys, and then I drove. Carla's voice said, "Today," like it was a warning siren, and then the bass suddenly felt smaller in my mind, like every hallway had ears, and I said, "What is this about?" And she didn't take the bait. She just repeated, "We need you in the command office as soon as you can." And then she added, softer, "Bring any documentation you have." And that word documentation told me Dean didn't just complain. He brought props. He brought a story with paperwork. He brought the kind of accusation that makes people sit up straight. And I hung up and sat in my car for full 3 breaths, hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went pale. And I had this neurotic little thought, not proud of it, but it's real. I thought, if I crash right now, I won't have to deal with this. And then I immediately hated myself for thinking it, because that's what stress does. It whispers cowardice like it's relief. And then I looked at my leg, steady, healed, and I remembered why I can't fold, because I didn't crawl out of that surgery and that debt and that humiliation just to be dragged back under by a man who chose a boat over my ability to walk. And then I drove, and the whole ride I kept replaying the pattern like a checklist. Dean loses control. Dean creates a public narrative. Dean recruits an authority figure. And then Dean pretends he's protecting people from me. And if you've lived this, you know the sick part. Sometimes outsiders believe them because it's easier to believe the difficult child than the charming parent. And I walked into the building, and the air hit me with that sterile office smell, copier toner, and cheap coffee. And the receptionist looked up too quickly, like she'd been warned I was coming, and she gave me that tight smile that says I'm being polite because I have to. And I signed in and sat down, and the chair felt like a witness stand. And there was a guy 2 seats over pretending to scroll on his phone, but his thumb wasn't moving. He was listening, and I wanted to laugh, because even in a place built on discipline, gossip still runs the show. And then the door opened and Carla stepped out, and she wasn't smiling, and she waved me back like I was walking into a storm. And when I entered the command office, 2 people were already there. Major Klein behind the desk, posture rigid, and Captain Reeves to the side holding a folder like it weighed something, and the folder was thick. And my first thought was, that's not one complaint. That's a campaign. And Major Klein didn't offer me a seat right away. He just looked at me and said, "Sergeant Liv." And his voice had that neutral authority that can either be professional or cold depending on what comes next. And I said, "Sir." And he nodded once and then said, "Sit." And I sat, back straight, hands folded the way training teaches you to do when you refuse to look guilty. And Captain Reeves opened the folder and slid one sheet across the desk toward me like he didn't want to touch it. And I glanced down, and my stomach tightened because it was a printed statement, signed, and there it was, my father's name, Dean Harlan, and the first line made my jaw clench. It said he was concerned for my mental stability after traumatic injury and financial stress. And I almost laughed because the audacity was so pure it was disgusting. He didn't help my injury. He created my financial stress, and now he's using both as proof I'm unstable. And Major Klein said, "Your father contacted the office," and then he paused, and he contacted legal, and then he added, and he contacted family services. And I looked up and said, "Sir, with respect, my father is not my chain of command." And Captain Reeves cleared his throat and said, "He alleged coercion." And I felt my heartbeat slow in that weird way it does when anger becomes clarity. And I said, "Coercion by who?" And Reeves hesitated just long enough to make it insulting, and then said, "He claims you're being influenced by an outside party to make financial decisions against your family." And I leaned back slightly and said, "An outside party?" And Major Klein said, "He suggested a predatory attorney, predatory lenders, and a romantic partner." And that last one was a shot in the ribs, because it wasn't even about the facts anymore. It was about shame, because Dean's favorite trick is to make me sound reckless, emotional, promiscuous, anything that makes authority figures treat me like a problem to manage. And I said, "There is no romantic partner involved." And then I added, "There is an attorney because my father refused to help with urgent surgery and I had to protect myself." And Captain Reeves flipped to another page and said, "He claims you made threats." and I blinked once slowly, and I said, I made no threats. And then Reeves read it out loud. And I want you to hear the kind of language people like Dean use, because it's always slippery, he wrote. My daughter said she would take everything from us and make us pay. And he wrote, she said we would regret not helping her. And that's when I realized what he'd done. He took the moment I went quiet on the phone, the moment I said, I understand. And he rewrote it as menace, because silence terrifies guilty people, and Major Klein said, do you have documentation to counter these allegations? And I nodded and said, yes, sir. And I pulled out my folder, the one I kept for months like a war plan, and I slid forward the medical note first, not because it was dramatic, but because it was factual. And I said, this is the diagnosis and urgency timeline. And then I slid the loan agreement, and I said, this is what I was forced into because I couldn't wait. And then I slid my bank statements showing the withdrawals and the paycheck timing, and I said, this is the reality of my finances at the time. And then I slid the text message history with Eli, my brother, the one who sold his tools, and I said, this is the only family member who showed up. And Captain Reeves' eyes flicked over the numbers, and his expression changed just a fraction, like the story was starting to smell different, and Major Klein asked, did your parents offer support in any form? And I said, no, sir. And then I added, my father explicitly refused $5,000 for surgery while he had just purchased a boat. And Reeves' eyebrows lifted, and Major Klein's face stayed neutral, but his eyes sharpened, and he said, your father did not mention a boat. And I gave a small nod because of course he didn't. And I said he wouldn't. And then Major Klein asked the question that felt like a blade. And what happened after? And this is where I had to choose between telling the whole truth and protecting an ongoing legal situation. So I said carefully, I took legal steps to protect my assets and separate myself from their finances. And Captain Reeves said, your father claims you defrauded them. And I let out one controlled breath and said, sir, I signed nothing on their behalf. I forged nothing. I threatened no one. And any agreements they entered were reviewed by counsel. And then I looked Major Klein in the eye and said, what my father is doing now is retaliation because he lost control. And then the room went quiet in that way that feels like the air is waiting. And Major Klein tapped his pen once and said, retaliation is a strong word. And I said, so is disability. And I didn't raise my voice, but I let it land. And Captain Reeves shifted his weight like he was uncomfortable. And I could tell he'd seen this kind of family dynamic before or not. The boat part, not the rich-poor theater, but the manipulation, the way someone tries to drag authority into a private punishment. And Major Klein said, your father requested a welfare check and an evaluation, and my stomach dropped because there it was, the nastiest weapon, not a lawsuit, not gossip, but a question mark over my competence. And I said, sir, I'm fit for duty. And Reeves said, that may be true, but we have to follow procedure when a credible report is made. And I wanted to ask, what makes him credible? His title of father, the same title he used like a shield while I was bleeding, but instead I stayed calm, and I said, understood, sir. And then I asked, may I ask what else he submitted? And Reeves hesitated and then slid another paper forward, and this one made my throat tighten because it was a printed screenshot from Sienna's phone, a clipped audio transcript, and it was edited, chopped, stripped of context, and the quote highlighted was me saying, I want to own it. And underneath Dean had written, she is obsessed with taking our assets. And I stared at it, and I almost admired the craft, because it's not a lie exactly, it's a truth with the spine removed. And I looked up and said, sir, that sentence was about protecting myself from their debt. And then I added, if you want the full recording, I can provide it through my attorney. And Major Klein nodded slowly. And then he said, we will need that. And then he said, Sergeant, I'm going to ask you something off the record. And that phrase off the record is never off the record in your nervous system. And he leaned forward and said, why would your father go this far? And I stared at him for a second and then answered honestly, because in his mind, I'm not a daughter. I said, I'm a role. And Captain Reeves frowned, and I continued, I'm the one who absorbs consequences, so he doesn't have to. And the moment I stopped doing that, he needed to punish me publicly so he could feel powerful again. And Major Klein sat back like he was processing something bigger than a complaint. And then he said, You understand we may have to restrict you temporarily pending evaluation, and my chest tightened, but I nodded, because panic helps nobody, and I said, understood. And then I asked, may I make one call? And he said, yes, and I stepped into the hallway and called my attorney, and when he answered, I didn't say hello, I said, Dean escalated to command. And my attorney's voice went calm in that dangerous way calm people get when they're about to get very precise, and he said, what did they receive? And I told him, and then he said, good. And I said, good. And he replied, because it confirms intent. And I swallowed and said, what do we do? And he said, we do what your father never expects. And then he lowered his voice. We go on offense with facts. And then, right as I was about to ask what that meant, Carla appeared at the end of the hallway and motioned me back in. And the look on her face told me something new had landed, something urgent. And when I stepped back into the office, Captain Reeves had his phone in his hand, and Major Klein's expression had shifted from neutral to alert, and Major Klein said, Sergeant, you need to hear this. And then he looked at the screen and said, your father just called again, and he paused, and he mentioned offshore accounts. And my blood went cold, because that wasn't just retaliation anymore. That was evidence, and I looked straight at the camera in my mind, at you, and I want you to answer this in the comments like you're sitting right here with me. If your parent was arrogant enough to brag to an authority figure about hidden money, would you protect them because they're family, or would you let them fall exactly the way they've always let you fall? Because Major Klein set the phone down and said, legal wants to speak with you immediately, and I knew in that moment, the next door that was about to open was not a family door, it was a federal one. Legal didn't call me into a room with flags and dramatic speeches. They called me into a plain conference office with a speakerphone in the middle like a landmine and a tray of stale water bottles nobody touched, and then Major Klein shut the door and said, this stays professional, which is the official way of saying, your life is about to get audited. And then Captain Reeves slid a consent form toward me and said, standard. And I almost laughed because nothing about this was standard, not for me, not for Dean, not for the little fantasy world my parents built where consequences are for other people. And then the speakerphone clicked and a woman's voice came through crisp and bored like she'd already had 10 versions of this conversation today. This is Counsel Ramirez, she said. I'm with the legal office. And then she added, Sergeant Liv, I need you to answer clearly and only what's asked. And I said, yes, ma'am. And then she asked, did your father mention offshore accounts during a call to this command? And I said, yes. And then she asked, do you have reason to believe he has concealed assets or engaged in financial misconduct? And the room got so quiet I could hear the air system breathing, and my brain did that neurotic split where one half is a soldier following instructions, and the other half is still that bleeding kid on a bunk hearing, we just bought a boat, and I said, carefully, I have reason to believe my parents have misrepresented their finances and used debt in ways they did not disclose. And then she said, do you have documentation? And I didn't hesitate. I said, yes, ma'am, through my attorney. And then she said, good. And I swear that one word had more weight than any apology my mother ever tried to write. And then she continued, because your father has now introduced information that triggers additional review. And Captain Reeves' eyes flicked up like, oh, so we're past family drama now. And I wanted to look at the camera in your mind and say, this is what happens when controlling people panic. They start bragging, and bragging becomes evidence. And then Counsel Ramirez said, Sergeant Liv, we are not investigating you at this time. And that phrase at this time is both a relief and a threat. And then she added, but we are obligated to assess whether you are being targeted or whether there is any risk to your duty readiness. And Major Klein asked, ma'am, what do you need from us? And she said, a timeline. And then she said, and a copy of the father's communications. And then she said, and I want Sergeant Liv evaluated for stress, not because I assume instability, but because I assume pressure. And I appreciated that because it was the first time someone in authority treated this as what it was, psychological warfare with a family name stamped on it. And then she said, Sergeant Liv, do you feel safe? And I paused and answered honestly. Physically, yes. Emotionally, I'm alert. And then I added, my father is not violent. He is controlling. And Counsel Ramirez said, control can be dangerous. And there was this beat where everyone in the room understood the same thing at the same time. Dean wasn't trying to help. He was trying to mark me as unstable, so anything I said later could be dismissed. And if you've ever had a parent do that, you know how sick it feels, because it's not just betrayal, it's reputation sabotage. And then Counsel Ramirez said, "One more question," and her tone sharpened like the tip of a pen. "Has your father contacted anyone else on base? Spouses, friends, chain of command adjacent?" And I said, "Not that I know of." And then I corrected myself. "Actually, yes. He contacted family services," and she said, "We have that." And then she said, "Sergeant, do not engage your father directly from this point without counsel." And Major Klein nodded and said, "Understood." And then the call ended, and the speakerphone went dead, and the silence afterward was heavier than the conversation. And then Captain Reeves finally exhaled and said, "He really set offshore." Like he couldn't believe someone would be that stupid, and I looked at him and said, "He can't stand not being the smartest person in the room." And then I added, "So he tries to sound powerful." And Major Klein stood up and said, "We're going to do two things," and his voice was steady. "We're going to follow procedure, and we're going to protect you from harassment." And then he looked at me and said, "Sergeant, you need to understand something." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Your father just escalated this beyond family." And I nodded and said, "I know." And then I said something I didn't plan to say. It just came out. He always does when he loses. And Captain Reeves glanced at me like, "That sentence has history." And then Major Klein said, "Carla will coordinate the evaluation and the documentation." And Carla nodded, but her eyes were warm for the first time, like she wanted to tell me she'd seen this movie before and hated the ending. And then Major Klein dismissed me, and I walked out into the hallway, and the first thing I noticed was how normal everything looked. People walking with coffee, someone laughing at a phone, a printer whining, and my body felt almost offended by how ordinary the world stayed while my family tried to detonate my life. And then my phone buzzed with a text from Eli, my brother, and it just said, "He called me." And that was it, no details, like he didn't even want the words on his screen, and my throat tightened and I typed back, "Are you okay?" And he replied, "Yeah, but he's spinning." And then another message, "He says you stole from them." And then another, "He says you're sick." And I stopped walking and leaned against the wall because even though I'd expected it, it still landed like a slap. Dean didn't just want to hurt me. He wanted to poison the only relationship that ever saved me. And this is where I need you to talk back to me, because I know somebody listening right now has lived this exact play. The moment you finally get free, and then the family tries to recruit the one person you love to pull you back under. So tell me in the comments, if you were Eli, would you even pick up that call, or would you block your own parent and sleep like a baby? Because Eli did pick up, and then he did something I didn't expect. He recorded it, and then he sent me a voice note, and I put in one earbud and listened while standing in that hallway like I was eavesdropping on my own life. And Dean's voice came through slick and familiar. "Eli's son, listen," he said. "Your sister is in trouble." And Eli said, calm but tight, "She was in trouble when she needed surgery." And Dean ignored that like it was static. "She's being manipulated," Dean said. "There's people around her, lawyers, lenders. She's not thinking straight." And Eli said, "She's thinking straighter than you." And I felt my chest ache, because Eli is not a dramatic man. When he speaks like that, it means his heart is bleeding too. And Dean lowered his voice into that fake concerned tone. "We need to get her help." And Eli said, "You mean you need to get control?" And then Dean snapped, and there it was, the real Dean. "Don't you dare talk to me like that." And Eli said, "Then don't call me and lie." And then Dean tried a new angle. He went for guilt. "After everything we did for you." And Eli laughed once, bitter, and said, "You mean after everything I did for myself?" And then Dean said the line that made my hands go cold. "If you don't help us, you'll lose her too." And Eli said, "I already lost her the day you chose a boat over her leg." And then Dean hissed, "Watch your mouth." And Eli said, "No, you watch yours, because I recorded this." And there was this stunned silence on the audio, and you can hear Dean's brain recalculating. You can hear him realize he's not talking to the old Eli anymore, the one who would fold. And then Dean said, "Quieter. Delete that." And Eli said, "No." And then Dean said, "You think she'll protect you?" And Eli said, "She already did." And then he hung up and I stood there staring at the wall because that was the moment I realized Dean's biggest fear wasn't losing money. It was losing the narrative, because money can be borrowed, but narrative is power, and he was watching his power slip. And then my phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from an unknown number, and it said, "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" And I didn't need a name to know it was Sienna. My sister, because she always talks like she's reading my mind and judging me for surviving, and I almost replied something savage. I almost did, because my brain can write petty poetry when I'm angry, but I remembered Counsel Ramirez's warning and I didn't respond. And then another text came, "Dad is spiraling because of you." And I stared at that word, "because of you," and I thought, wow, even now, my existence is framed as the problem, not their choices. And then Carla appeared beside me. Quietly, like she'd been walking behind me for a minute, and she said, "Don't answer." And I said, "I won't." And she nodded and said, "Good." And then she lowered her voice. "Between you and me, they're already pulling the call logs." And that sent a shiver through me. Not fear, something like anticipation, because when call logs get pulled, stories stop working. And then Carla said, "Go home, lock down your socials, don't meet anyone alone." And I nodded, and I walked out to my car with the sun in my eyes and my legs strong under me and my mind spinning. And then I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't do. I called my mother, not to beg, not to argue, just to test reality. And she picked up on the first ring like she'd been waiting, and she whispered, "Hello." And I said, "Mom." And she started crying immediately, like tears were her weapon of choice. And she said, "Baby, why are you doing this?" And I said, "Doing what?" And she said, "Hurting your father." And I laughed one dry laugh, and I said, "He hurt himself." And she said, "He's scared." And I said, "I was scared on a bunk with blood soaking through gauze." And she went quiet, and then she did what she always does. She tried to turn pain into a lesson. Maybe this is God teaching all of us. And I said, "No, this is consequences teaching all of us." And then she said, "Your sister says you're acting strange." And I said, "Of course she does." And then I asked the question that matters, the one I should have asked years ago. "Mom, tell me the truth. Did you ever plan to help me?" And she sniffed and said, "We thought you'd figure it out." And that sentence hit harder than any insult, because it was the whole family philosophy in one line. "You will suffer because you can." And then I said, "I did figure it out." And she whispered, "Then stop." And I said, "I already did. I stopped saving you." And then she hung up. And I sat in my car and stared at the steering wheel and felt oddly calm, because when someone finally says the quiet part out loud, it's like the spell breaks. And then my attorney called, and he didn't greet me. He said, "They're moving." And I said, "Who?" And he said, "The investigators." And then he added, "And your father just made one more mistake." And I said, "What?" And he said, "He filed a statement that contradicts bank records." And my stomach flipped. And then he said, "Which means?" And I interrupted, "He lied on paper." And my attorney said, "Exactly." And then he paused and his voice dropped. "And there's an emergency hearing possibility." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "For asset freezes and protective orders." And then he added, "But there's a complication." And my hand tightened on the phone, and I said, "What complication?" And he said, "Sienna just contacted the lender." And my heart sank, because I knew what that meant. She was trying to move money, reshape the story, or set someone else on me. And I whispered, "What did she do?" And my attorney said, "She tried to claim you're impersonating the company." And I felt my lips part in disbelief, because that's not just petty, that's criminal accusation territory. And I need you to hear this, because this is where revenge stories stop being entertainment and start being cautionary. When people are desperate, they will accuse you of things they're guilty of just to muddy the water. And then my attorney said, "I need you ready." And I said, "For what?" And he said, "To walk into a room where your father and your sister swear you're a fraud." And then he added, "And then we prove they're the frauds." And my chest tightened, and I looked straight ahead and thought, okay, so this is the moment the mask comes off in public. And if you were me, would you show mercy because they're blood, or would you show evidence because they never showed mercy when you were bleeding? Because the next meeting wasn't going to be a quiet family reckoning anymore. It was going to be A legal one, and then my phone buzzed again with a new message from an unknown number, and it was a photo, and the photo made my stomach drop because it was my old childhood house, my house now, with someone standing on the porch holding a key, and the caption under it said, "We're coming home." And that's when I realized they weren't just fighting me in paperwork, they were about to do something physical, something public, something desperate, and I promise you what happened next is the moment I stopped seeing them as my parents and started seeing them as a threat. The photo hit my screen like a punch, not because I was scared of them showing up, but because I could hear the performance before it happened. The porch would become a stage, the neighbors would become witnesses, and Dean would do what Dean always does when he's cornered. He would get loud and call it truth, and then he would dare anyone to challenge him. And I sat there in my car for a full minute watching my own breathing slow down, because I've learned something the hard way: panic is what manipulators feed on, and calm is what starves them. And then I called my attorney and said, "They're going to the house." And he didn't ask how I knew, he just said, "Do not go alone." And then he texted me an address and a time and said, "Meet me there now." And I drove with my hand steady on the wheel and my leg pressing the pedal like it belonged to me again. Because that's the irony. The thing they try to take from me, my ability to stand, is the thing that gave me the spine to stop bending. And when I pulled into the lot outside the property management office, there were already two people waiting, my attorney in a clean suit like he was born inside a courtroom, and a deputy with that neutral face cops get when they've seen every family lie to itself. And my attorney walked up and said, "You ready for the ugliest kind of theater?" And I said, "I'm ready for receipts." And he gave me the smallest grin like, "Good answer." And then he handed me a folder and said, "You speak only if necessary. You let paper talk first." And I nodded, and we drove to the house in 2 cars, and the closer we got the more my body remembered that street. The cracked sidewalk, the old oak that dropped leaves like it was shedding secrets. And when we turned the corner, there they were exactly like the photo. Dean on the porch with his chest puffed out, my mother behind him wringing her hands, and Sienna to the side filming on her phone already. Because of course she was. She's always needed an audience to believe her life matters. And there was a moving truck pulled halfway into the driveway like they'd already decided reality was optional. And the second Dean saw my car, he lifted his arms like he was welcoming a crowd. And I swear he smiled, like he'd been waiting for this confrontation the way some men wait for a fight at a bar. And the deputy stepped out first, and Dean's smile tightened because bullies love private victims. They hate neutral witnesses. And then my attorney stepped out and Dean started talking before anyone said a word. "There she is," he announced, loud enough for neighbors to hear through windows. "The one who stole our home." And my mother gasped dramatically like he'd just announced a tragedy, and Sienna swung her phone toward me and said, "Say hi, Liv," with this little sing-song voice like we were filming a prank. And I looked at her and thought, you can't be this old and still this hollow. And I didn't reply. I just stood next to my attorney and let the deputy speak, because authority has a way of draining the drama out of a yard. And the deputy said, "Sir, step off the porch." And Dean barked, "This is my house." And the deputy said, "Not according to the deed." And that's when Dean's eyes flicked for the first time. Just a tiny dart of panic, because he didn't expect someone to say deed out loud. And my attorney opened his folder and said, calm as a weather report, "Mr. Cross, you were served notice." And Dean snapped, "By who?" And my attorney said, "By the owner." And Dean pointed at me, "Her." And my attorney said, "The owning entity." And Sienna scoffed loudly for the camera. "It's fake," she said. "She's impersonating a company." And my attorney looked at her like she was a bug on glass and said, "Ma'am, I wouldn't speak while you're recording yourself making claims you can't prove." And Sienna's mouth tightened because for once someone wasn't buying her performance. And my mother stepped forward and did what she always does. She tried the soft knife. "Baby," she said, voice trembling, "please, your father is under so much stress." And I almost felt sorry for her for half a second, and then I remembered her voice on the phone saying a limp will teach responsibility. And that sympathy dried up like water on hot concrete, and I said, quietly, "You can stop calling me baby." And her face twitched like I'd slapped her, and Dean took that moment to surge back into dominance. "She's unstable," he told the deputy. "She's being manipulated." And the deputy didn't even look at him. He looked at my attorney and said, "Do you have documentation?" And my attorney said, "Yes." And he handed the deputy a stack of papers and said, "This includes the deed." the lease termination. And the notice served, and Dean leaned in trying to read over his shoulder, like he could intimidate Ink into changing, and then he did the stupidest thing possible. He reached for the papers, and the deputy stepped back and said, "Do not touch," and Dean froze, because the deputy's tone wasn't angry, it was final, and then Sienna started narrating like she was a reporter. "Guys, you're seeing this, right? She's trying to steal from us." And my attorney turned to her and said, "Stop recording." And Sienna said, "I'm allowed." And my attorney said, "You're allowed to record, you're not allowed to trespass." And that word trespass changed the air, because suddenly it wasn't family drama, it was legal language, and legal language doesn't care who gave birth to who. And Dean's face went red and he shouted, "This is what she does, she takes things too far." And I finally spoke just one line, because I wanted every neighbor listening to hear it. "I asked you for $5,000 so I could walk." And then I added, "You said the boat mattered more." And there was this tiny pause where even my mother's mouth opened and closed, because she couldn't rewrite that in front of strangers fast enough. And Dean snapped back, "Don't twist it." And I said, "It's not twisted, it's exact." And then I looked at Sienna and said, "And you laughed." And Sienna scoffed, but her eyes flickered, because she remembered. And you know what's wild? I didn't feel rage in that moment. I felt clarity, like finally putting a label on a jar that's been poisoning you for years. And the deputy finished reviewing the documents and said, "Mr. Cross, you need to leave the property." And Dean exploded, "You can't do this." And the deputy said, "You've already been notified." And then Dean turned to my mother and barked, "Tell them." And my mother stepped forward with tears again and said, "We're her parents," as if that was a legal argument. And the deputy didn't even blink. He said, "Ma'am, I'm not here for family relationships. I'm here for property rights." And I could have kissed that sentence, because it was the first time someone drew a clean line between blood and entitlement. And Dean tried one last weapon, shame. He looked straight at me and said, loud and cruel, "You're enjoying humiliating us." And I looked at him and answered honestly, "No." And then I said, "I'm enjoying breathing without begging." And my mother made a choking sound like she wanted to call it cruelty, but what she was hearing was just reality. And then Sienna got bold and said, "This won't last, we have money." And my attorney's head tilted slightly and he said, "About that." And he pulled out a document and handed it to the deputy. And then he looked at Dean and said, "Your statement to the lender contradicts your bank records." And Dean's eyes widened, just a flash, and my attorney continued, "And your recorded phone call about concealed accounts has been submitted." And the word recorded sucked the oxygen out of Dean's chest, and he turned his head sharply, like he wanted to find the microphone in the trees. And my mother whispered, "What recorded call?" And Sienna lowered her phone for the first time, and Dean's voice went thin. "That's illegal," he said, and my attorney said, "Not in this context." And then he added, "Also, you said it yourself." And Dean's mouth opened and closed, and I watched the exact moment the alpha mask cracked, because Dean's power has always depended on one thing: nobody calling his bluff. And now the bluff was stapled to a file, and the deputy said, "Sir, you have two options, you leave now or you leave in cuffs." And Dean looked around like he wanted someone to save him. Neighbors' curtains twitching, Sienna's face pale, my mother trembling, and for the first time, he looked small, not because he was punished, but because he was exposed. And he spat toward the ground and said, "This isn't over." And I nodded once and said, "I know," because I did know. Accountability doesn't end in one scene, it's a process. And then the deputy walked them down the steps like he was escorting strangers out of a building, and my mother turned back and tried one last plea, "Live, please." And I didn't answer, because any answer would have been a rope, and I was done being tied. And Sienna, as they reached the driveway, hissed, "You're going to regret this." And I said, "I already regretted trusting you." And she flinched like that one landed somewhere real. And then they got into their car, not the moving truck, just their car, and drove away with the truck sitting there like a dumb prop that never made it to the final act. And the yard went quiet, and my attorney exhaled and said, "That was the clean version." And I said, "Clean is good." And then my phone buzzed and it was Eli, and I answered and he said, "Did they show?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Did you fold?" And I laughed, a real laugh, and said, "No." And he said, "Good." And then he added, "Because Dad called me again." And my stomach tightened, and Eli said, and he said something that changes everything. And I stared at the house and felt that familiar click inside my chest, the sound of the next domino lining up, and I said, "What did he say?" And Eli paused and said, "He admitted where the money actually went." And that's the moment I want you to lean in, because what Dean finally confessed wasn't just about debt or a boat or ego. It was about a choice they made years ago that explains every single time they treated me like a spare part. And if you think refusing $5 grand was the worst of it, you're about to find out it was just the easiest part to say out loud.